Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm excited to talk about public education and charter schools. And a little bit about me. So my name's Kate Pattison. I've been with the Oregon Department of Education for almost 8 years. In April, it will be 8 years. And most of my time has been working with public charter schools. But I do a variety of things. That 5% of other duties as assigned ebbs and flows, and that's largely because I like to do a lot of things, and I have a kind of alternative route background that got me to the Oregon Department of Education. So some of the things that I really am passionate about and that I enjoy include strategic planning, and so I've done that for the agency for about 3 years. I also have owned small businesses. I serve on a number of nonprofit boards, both in Oregon and around the world. So I have a variety of experiences that uniquely positioned me to actually be the charter school person, which was not something I set out to do in life, which is usually how life works anyway. So I live in Silverton. I have 2 daughters who are ages 4 and 10. And my husband is an author and a writer, and we love living in Oregon. We've been here since 2005. So we've been here just a little while now, and this is very much our home. When we moved to Silverton, we decided to move there forever. That was going to be our final place, God willing. So we're very much committed to Oregon, and we're both products of public education and have really grown to love all of Oregon. And so I'm excited to infuse that perspective into my presentation today as I talk to you about public school choice in Oregon and what that looks like. I often describe my job as very dynamic. If you just walk into a room and say charter schools, you usually get dynamite and explosions. People either love them, they hate them, or they don't know what that is, and they kind of just stand there and watch the fireworks happen. So I never know exactly who I'm going to get, and it's probably likely that there's a little bit of that diversity in this room too. So some of you might be sitting here with some skepticism in the back of your mind, thinking, what on earth is she going to say that's going to be of any good? And some of you might be really excited and know a little bit about charter schools too. So I acknowledge that, and I think we should all acknowledge that the neighbor sitting next to you might have some very strong feelings about public charter schools. The first thing before we get into the content, I just wanted to acknowledge, are there any public educators in the room? Folks who are K-12 educators? Awesome. Thank you for your service and for the work that you've done. As mentioned in the introduction, public education is absolutely a pillar and foundation to democracy and to the welfare of all communities, and that is what I'm passionate about. And it also is interesting because charter schools, there are some folks in the movement, if you would, and some of the criticisms of charter schools is that it's trying to privatize public education, which we'll talk about some of those things as we go through the presentation today. There's also that idea that one size doesn't necessarily fit all. And as how many of you went through public schools growing up? And you look around the room and you've had, some life now, and you might realize that maybe it wasn't a perfect fit for everybody. And you've probably met someone in your life that, it was a struggle to go to school. And we also know that a lot of what traditional public school systems do is create people to, go through a certain system. And the world is changing rapidly, and the workforce is changing. So all these things are happening, and public charter schools are kind of one of those pieces that fit into the response to that one size doesn't necessarily fit all. School choice. Charter schools are public schools within school choice. So what is school choice? First, let's start with what is a neighborhood public school? every student in Oregon, and so I'm going to talk very specific to Oregon, but of course this generally translates to the entire United States. But every student in Oregon is given the right and the opportunity for a free, public, appropriate education. There are some times where families choose something else. So I'm curious, for those of you who maybe didn't raise your hand that you went to a public school, there was maybe a private school option, homeschool option, maybe a magnet school is another common term of a type of school. Those are all parts of school choice, where you have citizens exercising their right to then also choose to not participate in the traditional public education system. Public charter schools are another avenue for school choice, and so they kind of fall under the umbrella of parents and citizens exercising their right to go somewhere else and get an education in a different venue. And public charter schools fit within that, but they're also publicly funded. And so even though they're separate, and there are some pieces that are different, they're still part of the public system. And so we're going to talk a little bit today also about some of that tension. What happens when you create flexibility, give some autonomy, but still require these folks to work within the typical and legislated system of public education. I'm managing 2 computers today, so I'll get in the flow here pretty quick. So in the beginning, 1991, which was not that long ago actually, but in the beginning, there was the beginning of school choice with public charter schools in Minnesota. So Minnesota was the first state to legislate the use of public funds for these semi-autonomous schools. Oregon followed along. There was some, early kind of rumblings around of how we're going to create these schools that are different but still in the system. And then in 1999, the Oregon legislature with Senate Bill 200 had its first public charter school legislation pass. And what that law did was it gave school districts the authorization to allow and approve these schools to be created within their districts. So kind of a brief overview, really quick, of how Oregon public education is organized, and I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this, but in Oregon we have school districts, and there are school districts all over the state. We have 197 of them, and every school district has a local board, and that board are publicly elected officials who serve on that local school board. Any school board members in the room? That's a great volunteer opportunity. I highly recommend it for everybody. It's a great way to give back to your community and serve. So those public officials that govern the local school district can receive applications from community members who want to start a charter school. They have an idea. They say, this kind of school will be different than the regular school, and we want to start it here. So they'll develop this very lengthy proposal. There's a lot of law and legalese and all the things that have to go into it. We always say, and starting a proposal for a charter school, it's very difficult, but it's also the easiest part of having a charter school is the application part. So people cry and get really upset about the process, and we're like, this is the easy part. Wait until you got kids. Anyway, so the charter school has to start with the local school district. If the school district does not approve the application, they can appeal that to the state. So there's kind of a check and balance in there to make sure that the district is actually appropriately reviewing these applications. But there's also this other method for charter schools to exist, and that's through the state board. And we'll talk about how that's played out in the state. But for the most part, these schools, which are also governed by a separate nonprofit board. So you have your local school district with its locally and publicly elected officials governing the school district, and that board says, we'll start a charter school. And that charter school also has to have a board, but they don't have to be publicly elected. They can be, but they don't have to be. But they do have to be a 501c3 and a public Oregon nonprofit that follows public meetings and public records laws. That board is in charge of the school. The district sends the money to the charter school, and the charter school then has some autonomy. They get to make their own budget, they get to make their own calendar, they get to hire their own teachers. They don't have to be unionized teachers and represented. So that's a point of debate and contention too. We'll talk about that. They can do different curriculum and have different methodologies or instructional materials. And all of these things come together to create these schools that are then different, but still in the system. And they're often not the schools of the past. There are a lot of variation within Oregon public charter schools. So specifically to our state, right now we have 127 public charter schools operating in Oregon. There have been a lot of schools over the years that have opened and that have closed. The number one reason that charter schools close in Oregon is because of financial reasons. It's really hard to operate a school at all, let alone operate a public charter school that typically doesn't have the institutional knowledge, the infrastructure, and the big support that our school districts offer. And there are different levels of relationship and support that charter schools get from their districts. Sometimes they get along, and sometimes they don't. And so they work very separately. There are a lot of charter schools that are virtual charter schools, which means they're 100% online. There are charter schools that work often without much of a classroom at all. And they're either in the family's home or they're out at the park or the seaside or in the mountains. So there's big variety within public charter schools. One of the phrases that we often use with public charter schools is autonomy in exchange for accountability. So they get some autonomy to do things different, but ultimately the line is, the consequence is pretty big. We don't usually go around the state and just close down underperforming schools, right? We say, please improve, here's some more resources, here's maybe some sanctions if you would, or some other supports that we're going to put around you. You might get federal funds to help the school improve. But with a charter school, if you're not doing what you said you would do, or if you're not performing well, the idea is the school district or the authorizer could shut you down, could say we're not going to renew your contract, or we're going to terminate you as a charter school. So it's autonomy in exchange for very high levels of accountability. This map here shows you where charter schools are located in Oregon. These are all of the more traditional brick and mortar schools. And you can see that the concentration, of course, is in the Portland metro area along the I-5 corridor. But we do see a number of charter schools in Eastern Oregon and a lot of the rural communities. These are our 13 virtual public charter schools. So like I said earlier, virtual public charter schools are those schools that offer almost all of their instruction and materials and everything online. So students all the way from kindergarten through 12th grade are receiving almost 100% of their instruction through an online platform, and they typically call that a learning management system. Sometimes it's asynchronous, and sometimes it's synchronous. So sometimes they're actually getting like a live cast of a teacher on the other side of the computer live, and sometimes it's more of a dynamic experience with the materials online that kind of are self-directed and give correction as you go. But teachers are supposed to be available all the time that these students are engaging with online instruction. This map shows you where the schools are located when they are the only, I said that wrong. When they are a charter school that's part of a district that has many schools. So most of the charter schools in the state are authorized by a school district that has many schools. For example, Portland Public has the most charter schools in the state. It's also the largest district, so that makes sense. It has, I think right now they have 7 charter schools, maybe 8. Another one close. So they have 7 right now. They were up to 9 at one point, but then a few of them have closed. This slide shows you our 20, what we call single school districts that are charter schools. It's a mouthful. But basically what that means is in Oregon, because we have so many rural places and parts of the state where school districts are responsible for just one school. They have a K-12 single school in their district. Some of those districts have converted their one school to a charter school. Why would you do that? Well, there's 2 major, maybe 3 major reasons why districts have done that over the last 15 years. Number 1, a charter school can admit students from anywhere. So a traditional neighborhood school would admit students based on geography. If you live within this boundary, you go to this school. A charter school can admit from anywhere. So you can cross boundaries and you don't need permission to do that. And so these single school districts, as their enrollment was declining, said, well, how are we going to get more kids? Maybe if we become a charter school, we can recruit kids. Then it became a little controversial. Maybe we can bus kids and go get them from another district. You can imagine, yeah. Which you're not supposed to do as a traditional public school. But again, there are less regulations for public charter schools. So this is one of the ways that public charter schools is played out in Oregon that's a little different than some of the other places in the country. So we have these single school districts that aren't often with 2 boards. It's the one board can be the board for the district and the charter school, which is kind of, if anyone is a contract lawyer, you would know that this is a little bit of hoops or smoke and mirrors or something where they're contracting with themselves to be a charter school. But the law allows it, and to date, there hasn't been anyone to challenge it in court, so we'll just go with that. But basically, they're contracting with themselves to be a charter school, and that allows them to take their buses and go anywhere and get kids and bring them back to their school. Now, why would a kid want to go to this rural school over this rural school? We have, for the last, I think it's been almost 15 years, had a federal charter school grant almost that whole time. There was a little lapse where we didn't. And that federal charter school grant was for startup funds that allowed the state to give grants to local groups that were starting a charter school. And charter schools could get about $500,000 to invest in equipment, supplies, professional development, and a lot of these single school districts utilized those funds. They applied for them, they became a charter school, and then they used those funds to invest in pretty spectacular technology. At the time, having a 1-to-1 ratio of iPads in a classroom, 15 years ago. Did they have iPads 15 years ago? But you get what I'm saying. It's like how much has changed in the last 15 years. Now that's like, okay, that's pretty typical in a school. You can find a lot of technology, even though I would say we probably need more funding to support more technology and opportunities for all of our kids. That might have been me doing my own little personal plug there, off the clock, sorry. But anyway, so these districts were investing in that kind of technology, or one district invested in pretty awesome manufacturing technology so that their students could do laser cutting with metal and these fantastic high-tech welding programs. And so they were able to then attract kids and not just have to recruit them, but attract kids to their schools and increase their enrollment and remain viable and sustainable. But you can imagine that neighbors became angry with each other. And so there's a lot of stories and a lot of tension related to this map, especially out here. Finally, there are 4 public charter schools that are authorized directly by the State Board of Education. And if you remember earlier, I said that if a charter school, you always have to apply to the school district first, but if the school district denies you, you could appeal that to the state board. The state board, over the years, has approved 5 actually, 1 is closed, but 4 public charter schools that operate in a local district, but they're not sponsored or authorized by a local district. So that creates a whole other dynamic that's also very challenging and interesting too. So there are 4, the 2 in Portland, 1 in Ontario, which I'm going to next week, and then 1 in Salem. I have a couple questions I was just going to ask first. So I'm curious, all of you in the room, how many of you have children, grandchildren, or neighbors who attend a public charter school? A handful of you. How many of you have ever been in a public charter school? A few more of you. Okay. So some of you are relatively familiar with public charter schools. I just always think that's good. The next question is, based on what you've heard about public charter schools, so this is going to be like a thumbs up, middle, or down, how would you say public charter schools are doing? How are they performing? Thumbs up means, I don't know, maybe they're doing really well. Middle is like moderate, and down would be, I think they're failing. A lot of these, a couple of these, and a few of these. True. So overall, public charter schools are kind of just doing, you know? I mean, when you take the whole average, and they're so ranging in terms of their program. You have everything from these full virtuals to these outdoor education to very classical, traditional education to language immersion, Montessori, Waldorf-inspired, everything, right? And then we put them all into one group and we say, how are they doing? Generally speaking, they do a little bit better with English language arts. And this is old data, but I wanted to show it to you. Here's more recent data. And in this case, the blue is the charter schools and the red is the state average. And they do a little bit worse in math when we look at those content areas. Graduation rates are typically lower, but that's because of a majority of the students in public charter schools that are high schoolers are in virtual public charter schools. And virtuals are this whole other thing. So virtual public charter schools say, as operators, they say, well, we're serving alternative kids, right? Kids who need flexibility or who are struggling or who are coming to us because their neighborhood school was failing them and they need something different. And we're currently working on some data to see how true that is. That's what they're saying. And what we're saying is, just looking at the data, if you go to a virtual public charter school, you're much less likely to graduate. But again, what they're saying is the kids who are already coming to them are those who were probably going to drop out anyway. So it's really, it's a difficult topic, virtual public charter schools, and they've been highly debated both in the legislature and at the state board for the last 10 years. There's been a lot. And I would say that in all the areas where you would expect, public charter schools are part of their legislative mission is to go be innovative, right? We've given you flexibility, now go innovate, do something with that. And I would say that virtual education is probably the main area where charter schools have pushed and forced the rest of the public education system to move into the 21st century and embrace that online education is definitely something that's going to be part of our future. Now, how do we do that well is a whole other lecture for another day when I bring in other experts who know more about that than I do. But that plays into some of this data as well. When we look at who is attending the public charter schools, we do see a particular story within the demographics. Public charter schools tend to serve students who are more often white, who are more often English language speakers, like native English speakers, and who have more resources. So you can see the data here that we have a difference overall in the number of students who are, a percent of students who are white attending public charter schools. There are more students who are white, more students who are Hispanic. Sorry, I realized now my slide overlapped a little bit there. And there are fewer English language learners in public charter schools. So those are students who either have a different language spoken at home other than English, or their native language is not English, and they need additional supports to gain English language proficiency. And there are fewer students in poverty attending public charter schools. So this is usually when we have the folks on this one side of the debate of charter schools that say, yeah, see, they're trying to privatize schools. We have what we call white flight, you know, people trying to leave the traditional public school system and that accepts everybody and, you know, takes that mission on to create these public schools using public funds that don't serve everybody. And, you know, there's a lot of, in every community, I think everyone in the community needs to look at those schools and say, well, what's really happening here? Because sometimes that might be the case, and other times that might not be the case. And so there's a story in every public charter school. What I'd like to do now is, and hopefully this, I have it all queued up, but you never know with technology. Sometimes, even though I tested it earlier, it might not work. I would like to show you a couple videos that are a little bit more colorful than just me, because I always wear black. And there's students, there's teachers and students talking about their own experience. I've chosen 4 public charter schools to kind of showcase today. They all have very different models and philosophies, and I think that they'll be able to tell their own story better than I can tell it. So the first is the Redmond Proficiency Academy, and this school serves middle school grades and high school grades. Proficiency is kind of this idea that the school shouldn't get credit and the student shouldn't just be forced to just sit in a seat for the whole year, and the class just goes at the same pace for every single kid, and you get one chance on a test to show whether or not you know something. Proficiency model, the idea behind it is some kids are going to move faster, some kids are going to move slower, some kids might do well on a test, and some kids would rather write a paper or do a speech or something. And so the students have more flexibility in how they show you that they learned the content, and there's more flexibility in the pacing of how the content is delivered and at what speed it is. So I'm going to go ahead and open this, and then we'll move on to the next one.
Why is RPA awesome? Why is RPA awesome? There are many reasons for that.
There's so many things that are different about RPA.
I actually enjoy going to school.
They approach education differently. We don't have to necessarily follow one strict schedule in our day.
We're able to just schedule freely, so it works really well with my work schedule.
RPA's allowed me to play 3 sports every year at high school.
It's really nice to be able to move my schedule around and work with teachers to formulate a plan that's going to work for me and help me graduate and make sure I get everything done on time.
RPA has furthered my education because I'm given the ability to treat it like a college education and manage my own time.
There's a lot more freedom here.
I'm very much a self-directed learner.
You can take control of your education the way you want it and not the way somebody else sees it.
It's a huge difference. You actually have to do stuff, think stuff.
I'm actually learning the stuff that I'm supposed to learn instead of just jumping through hoops.
RPA has a really unique atmosphere that really does incorporate the motto, "We are one."
You don't have a lot of pressure to be anyone. You can be yourself, and you're just comfortable.
You can trust the students.
They treat you with respect.
Everything's very fluid. You can go talk to anyone.
We're all very close, you know. I am RPA, we are one. They're still the individual, but we still come together under RPA.
The teachers care so much about their students.
They help you a lot with any of your schoolwork.
I can have a discussion with them almost as a peer rather than just a student and a teacher.
You can call them and email them, and they will always help you.
I can always contact someone and they can answer what I need 24/7. RPA has so many unique opportunities.
It's one of the only schools that has a newspaper.
I got to go on a rafting trip.
I get to go to Blazer games.
We got a chance to go up to OHSU up in Portland, and we got to see the cadaver lab.
I've gotten to create like 3 or 4 classes of my own.
It's been really cool to start a Bible study club.
Gandhi coming to our school to talk.
That every morning when I got up, I had to tell myself that today I'm going to be a better human being than I was yesterday.
RPA has allowed me to go to more advanced classes that I wouldn't be able to go to in a normal school.
I'm able to take college classes.
I've already finished my first year of COCC biology, so I don't have to take that again in college.
It's allowed me to take multiple science classes and just go right after what I want to do with my life.
It's basically preparing you for post-secondary education as well as being comfortable in your own skin.
It's really provided that opportunity for me to discover what I want to do before I have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for it.
It's opened a lot of doors for me.
It gives me opportunities, especially that I didn't have before I came here.
I feel really involved in my education. I feel like I'm earning it instead of just scraping by.
And that's why RPA is awesome.
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 Fantastic. So the next school that we're going to take a look at is called the Community Roots School. And full disclosure, my 10-year-old daughter attends Community Roots School. It's located in Silverton. I'm not even, well, let's just say I wasn't particularly inclined to send my kid to a public charter school in general, but we got invested in Montessori education in her preschool years, and there also happened to be a public Montessori school in our community, so we said, let's go for it. So this is my daughter's school. It's a K-8, well, it's K-7 right now, and going to be K-8 Montessori school. So how many of you are familiar with what Montessori is? A lot of you. Montessori was based on the work of Maria Montessori out of Italy. It's really about hands-on, taking students from this very concrete to an abstract in terms of how they're going to learn, and lots of manipulatives. It's a curated environment, but as they get older, they get to do a lot more tangible, practical skills. And so that's what you'll see in this video. This was for a grant that they were successful in receiving to do some microeconomy.
My name is Susan Andre, and I'm the lead guide at Community Roots Charter School for the Adolescent Program. And we are a Montessori school, which means that we provide a lot of experiential learning for our students. For the middle school, what that means is we spend some of our time at a local farm. That's what most Montessori middle schools will do in some form or another. The students will be engaging in productive work in balance with their academic studies. So one of the pieces of a Montessori program is that they have economic production. We call it microeconomy. And the students design a business and take that business out into the community and practice selling, and usually what is done in that microeconomy is that they're making products.
I think we should sell popcorn because it would be a healthier and easier choice than buying the store-bought kind.
I think that we should sell canned things because
We've recently learned how to do canning and do that process, and it's fun and it's an easy way to preserve food.
I think I'd like to sell paracord bracelets because they're pretty cool and they're fun and easy to make, and a lot of people that I know enjoy them.
I think we should have plant starts for so people can have gardens.
It would give us an experience on being a young adult, and then when we're older, we'd already have that knowledge.
To do all of these things, it takes a lot of startup supplies and marketing materials, and the students are in the process of making the choices about what their plan will be, and it's guided by adults, but they get to have a say in that process. So the grant as a Kickstarter will allow us to get all of our startup supplies so we can hit the ground running, and then the money that we make we can reinvest and keep growing our economic production, which is really one of the pillars of a Montessori program. They're getting practical skills. They're learning how to make food. They're learning how to make products. They're learning how to work with customers. They're learning how to handle money, what a spreadsheet looks like, and they know what income and expenditures and revenue, and they get to work all of that through a real project. When you take a product that you've made that you're bringing to the community and selling, there's this sense of value and this sense of pride in having made something. And that's more than just the practical skills of knowing how to balance a budget. They're going to carry that feeling with them on into their adult lives.
All right, so the next video that I'm going to show you is from, it's actually not this one. From the Cottonwood School of Civics and Science. This school is a place-based school, and they're located in the Southwest waterfront in Portland, and they do place-based education, which means that they derive most of their curriculum and materials and inspiration for learning from the environment around them, which includes the natural environment, the cultural environment, the built environment, the language, the very much the place that they're in. And so you'll get to see a little bit about what these students did in middle school.
This semester, the 7th graders worked on a project called Project Citizen, which is where they identify a problem in their community and they research it and seek out policy-based solutions to address that problem.
Project Citizen is a great example of place-based education because a big part of place-based education is this piece of civic engagement, where students not only are learning about how government works and how decisions are made publicly, but how they can actually become part of that process.
First, we went out to our community and interviewed our community about what major problems we could fix.
One of the problems is needle waste from drugs, and another would be lack of men's domestic abuse shelters in Portland.
We decided on to help fix the lack of awareness around domestic abuse for everyone, including men, and that there are resources for everyone to get help.
We chose that, and then we did this really extensive research.
Research is a pretty big thing, but we also do interviews.
They learned through research that actually 2 out of the 3 domestic abuse shelters in Portland accept male and trans victims. So we're actually a really progressive city, so they changed the topic about halfway through based on their research.
We saw the problem of not many people knowing that there are resources for everyone, not many people knowing that it happens to that domestic abuse can happen to anyone, and so we decided that there should be more awareness around that.
In order to increase awareness of this issue, the students developed an action plan. Their idea was to create a public awareness campaign with ads to be posted on buses and billboards and flyers around the city. They took this plan and presented to a panel of judges at the Capitol.
We're going to be talking about the problem that our class has chosen, the lack of awareness around public policies surrounding men who have been domestically abused.
The main focus of our ads is to inform men that they have the same access as women to shelters. Thank you for your time.
While they were presenting, I was just sucking back my tears. I was holding them back because they were doing such a good job. She announced the winner, and I don't know. I was just so stoked for the kids. Place-based education allows students to feel invested in their learning because the learning is authentic. The tasks are bigger than just the classroom.
So this program has really helped students understand their community, who are all the people in the community to be involved with in solving a problem, but most importantly, how do you talk to government and try to urge government to make a change when it comes to solving problems?
All right. Finally, the last one that we're going to watch, and then I believe I might answer a few questions and we'll take a break, is Arco Iris. This school is in Beaverton, and it's a Spanish immersion school. And so students who attend this school typically are receiving all of their instruction, or a large percentage of their instruction, in Spanish. And they have, overall, when we look at the information about the school, it's pretty fantastic. The students do really well. They have a relatively diverse student population and teacher population as well that represents the language and the culture surrounding Latin American Spanish. So I'm going to show you this video.
Típico en Arco Iris es despertar en la mañana y listo para la escuela, y cuando viene a la escuela empiezan con una reunión de la mañana y después hacer las matemáticas, tener merienda, empezar español como el leyendo en silencio, después vamos al recreo. Y después del recreo vamos al español otra vez o ciencias. Después de esto nos van al almuerzo. Después del almuerzo vamos a la inglés, como leer en silencio en inglés. Y después de inglés, esto es como el resto del día. A veces estudios sociales y después salir.
I'm Ann Rattay. I am the grandmother to a very precocious 6th grader named Chloe, and we just love it here at Arco Iris.
Mi clase preferida es... Esto es difícil porque a mí me gustan muchas clases.
Yo me llamo Jana, yo estoy en el 4º grado. Mi clase favorita es arte, porque me gusta hacer dibujas como con muchos colores.
My husband and I both chose Arco Iris for our son because we wanted him to be in a smaller learning community. We wanted him to be a global thinker. We wanted him to learn a different type of math than what he was learning at his school. There's quite a few reasons actually why we decided to have him move to Arco Iris.
I did not want my granddaughter to be limited by language, which I found my own self in my own career being limited, but traveling all over, people know 3-4 languages, and here in the US we don't. And what I discovered is the business language used to be English, but with emerging markets such as in China and in Latin America, where it is not necessarily the language of business, it was really important to pick one of those languages and have her immersed And I chose Spanish just because of the multicultural nature that we have here in the United States.
My husband and I had gone to a meeting, about the school here, and they had talked about how they were going to use Singapore math. And it's not adapted, by the district, so we went ahead and we Googled it and looked it up, and we just found a wealth of information about it. With the Singapore math, he's learning how to work things out in different ways and mentally. So he'll sit down and he'll do a problem in his head, whereas I have to write it down, and he and I'll get the same answer, the right answer. And to me, it's amazing. He's really just developed and grown a lot with his competency in math this year.
Any organization, whether it's school, a business, you have a 5-year plan where you're either going to succeed or fail. Now we've gotten a little bigger, we've grown, we're meeting the next targets, we've gone back, and school board and parents and teachers have all reassessed where do we want to go, what is it we need from our teachers. And so what I'm seeing year after year is this growth. In 5 years, we need to be basically at that meets level that I expect for a school to have. So that we can go from there and add on. And I think we're on target here at Arco Iris.
All right, so there you got to see some little snapshots into what it looks like for some of our public charter school students around Oregon. And I think at this point, we'll go ahead and open it up for some questions. And so I know that you all have a system with your microphones. And so I'm not sure if you pass them or if you raise hands for a microphone. Raise hands for a microphone.
Hi, my name's Roz. Is there a standard minimal curriculum that charter schools have to meet in order to get taxpayers' dollars?
Sure. So public charter schools in Oregon do have some laws that they can't waive, they can't get out of, if you would. And following the state board adopted content standards is the same for public charter schools as it is for your neighborhood traditional public school. So the standards, they have to teach to the standards. They can use different materials and curriculum to get there, but the standards apply for all the students.
Hi, my name is Eunice. I was a little bit familiar with Howard Street Charter School here in Salem. Is that still, or is it no more, or
No,
where is
yes.
it?
Salem Kaiser has 4 public charter schools. Howard Street Middle School is one of them. They also have Optimum Learning Environment, the Jane Goodall Middle School, and Valley Inquiry. The Salem Kaiser public charter schools do perform pretty well across the board, and they're a little bit unique in that all of the teachers who work in their schools are employees of the school district. So they're still under the bargaining agreement for the school district. That's a little different than most charter schools across the state, but not completely unique to them.
Hi, my name is Joan. I actually have 2 questions, but I'll just ask one because that's the rule. For years, we've heard that smaller classes will lead to better outcomes, and it seems, I am not an educator, merely a product of many, many years of school, but it doesn't appear on the basis of the data you have about the charter schools that by itself is enough. Do you know why the charter schools are doing maybe a tiny bit better in English, but it looks like pretty much worse in math, even though they have smaller classes and possibly are more selective?
Mm-hmm. So one of the legislative intents for charter schools is that they would also create smaller learning environments for students. And while probably a lot of charter schools do have smaller class sizes than their neighborhood schools, it's not consistent across the board. So it's hard to speak to the data specifically or really knowledgeably, or, just because every school there's so much variability within the data itself. Plus, we have most of the virtuals are mixed into that, and virtual schools could potentially have much larger class sizes. There isn't a good answer to your question, unfortunately, but when we look into school by school, I think that's where you can get into some of that nuance, but unfortunately I don't have a clean, easy answer for you.
My name is David. I attended both public schools and private schools because I lived overseas for quite a while. I don't understand if charter schools have certain things that are better than public schools, why the public school system just doesn't adopt whatever it is. So would you address this type of issue?
So what I could say that's probably the most general answer to that is the traditional public school system, is many, many decades long in terms of its institutional momentum and its levels of bureaucracy, which are both pros and cons, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing that there's institutional knowledge, and having that momentum and whatnot kind of keeps the ship from going crazy. And still, it can be hard, I think, within the big system to be nimble and to quickly adjust to advances in technology or new changes in methodology, especially since most of your teachers who are learning how to teach, are in college now, and then they'll get into the school, and by the time they're even a good teacher, some start, but by year 3 or so, when they're gelled into what they're doing was based on what they learned, 4 to 6 years ago. So it's hard to be nimble. I think that public charter schools and some private schools maybe have more flexibility to be nimble and can quickly change curriculum 1 year to the next, or their instructional materials, or can decide to invest in new professional development maybe faster. But it's really across the, it varies. And so that's kind of a broad answer to your question. Does that kind of get there? Sort of.
Hi, this is Lester. A myriad of questions, but I'll just use one of them. A lot of these schools are at the middle school and don't progress to the through the graduation, go to high school, I assume, when they move out of the charter school. What type of data do you have on the success of those students that are coming out of the charter schools versus those that have went through the total public school system?
Right. So most of the public charter schools in Oregon do end at grade 8 or are some variety of elementary configuration. And I don't have actual data on that at this point. We haven't analyzed that broadly. And, but I have looked recently at a couple schools, and those students are doing a little bit better than the state average overall in terms of those students graduating from high school. There's so many factors that go into that, though, that it's hard to always definitively correlate it back to the charter schools' work and success necessarily. So I think a lot of our data analysts folks are a little hesitant. The researcher in them is like, oh, there's so many factors, we can't correlate that perfectly. But that's something that we're starting, especially as we're having more longitudinal data, we'll be able to look at some of those trends. But yeah, so that is a piece that we're starting to look into.
I'm Joyce, and I wondered if I had a child that had a disability and they would be required to have some type of special education, what would be my chances of being admitted to a charter school?
Right. So that is one of those pieces. Public charter schools in Oregon have to follow all of the federal law and then most of the state laws, but not all of the state laws. So if a student has a need for additional supports and is identified with a disability that would then require an individualized education plan, an IEP, that would be part of the process and the educational supports that a public charter school would offer. In Oregon, the way it's kind of governed, though, is that the local school district would provide those supports. And so there would be that relationship, again, with the charter school and the district there for the student. But the student should have the same access at a local public charter school, that they would at their neighborhood school, in theory. And it doesn't always play out that way. But there's always, every story has its nuance, and we can say this is exactly what the letter of the law says, and then this is how it plays out. But that's what it is supposed to happen. So it's supposed to be the same access.
Hi, I'm Don. You showed us one slide that showed us that the demographics between the charter schools and the regular public schools are different. And then you showed us another slide that compared the two types of schools in reading and math achievement. Do you have any figures or slides that would control for race, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, and then comparing the two schools after controlling for those three factors?
So I don't have any slides today. That's something that we could potentially do. I don't think to date that the department has done that specifically, but I think it's up and coming in the next year or so, probably before the 2019 legislative session. We'll be doing some more data briefs on some of the particularities on charter school performance overall. So unfortunately, I don't have those slides today. And in terms of, again, area by area, I am very familiar with some schools and some school districts and their data because of different projects that I've worked on or different complaints I've investigated. And again, it's very different school to school, how that plays out. Some public charter schools, students of color are so underserved at that school, at the charter school, that statistically speaking, they would be better served at their neighborhood school. Now, there are a lot of reasons why people choose charter schools, right? Maybe that student was bullied at the neighborhood school. Maybe they didn't, there could be all number of reasons why the family chose the charter school. So maybe the student wouldn't be better served there, but sometimes that's what the data shows. And some public charter schools are are very much outperforming their neighborhood school by demographics. When you look at students with disabilities, students that are historically underserved, and so on.
Hi, this is Mika. I'm interested in the virtual charter schools as far as do they all use the same curriculum, because that must be a lot of software and maybe there's a lot out there they can choose from, and then if it's different for different districts, then maybe for example, a Salem student would go to a Madras charter school virtually. Mm-hmm. And is that possible?
Right. So of the 13 virtual public charter schools in Oregon, almost all of them serve students statewide. So you could be anywhere in the state and attend a public virtual charter school. The virtual charter schools then are required, if students don't have good access to internet or don't have it, to provide it. If they don't have a computer or the resources to get a computer, the charter school is supposed to provide it. In terms of the actual curriculum and materials that are provided, again, there's a lot of diversity. There are two major corporations that are represented in Oregon that are for-profit companies that contract with public charter schools to be their kind of provider of curriculum and management services, and that's the Connections Academy. They're based out of Baltimore. And then there's K-12. And has anybody heard of these companies? If you follow the news, California, Ohio, Florida, there have been major lawsuits and things happening related to particularly K-12, and they have 2 public charter schools in Oregon, and then Connections Academy is the largest school in Oregon, and it is the largest virtual public charter school as well. So K-12, it's largely the same between the 2 schools, but they do things a little different. And then Connections, it's the same. And then all the other little virtual charter schools are kind of like mom and pop virtual charter schools, where they've either developed their own learning management system or they're pulling from a lot of different pieces and creating something.
Okay, well, you can tell there's a lot of interest in and questions about charter schools, so we hope they'll have time for more questions. A lot of people are waiting. So thank you very much, and we'll take a 10-minute break.
All right, so the next part of the conversation that we're going to talk about is related to the last on the side question I got, which was related to teachers. So probably one of the biggest flexibilities that charter schools have in Oregon is the ability to employ teachers who are, first, not necessarily represented by a union. So public charter school teachers can be part of the district's union, or they can separately organize on their own, which we have 2 public charter schools in Oregon where the teachers have organized and started their own union. And then they also, so that's the first flexibility within the teacher component. The other piece is not all public charter school teachers have to have an Oregon license. I know, right? It's a little freaky. People start going, what are you talking about? And there are a few safeguards in place there, but there aren't a whole lot of regulations about this anymore, especially since No Child Left Behind is now, in the past, and we are under new federal regulations related to the requirements federally for teachers in the state. And since we as a state do receive federal funds, those regulations would apply to Oregon. So to address the first part around teachers and whether or not they're part of represented by a union or not, that has been part of the original debate and has been highly charged from the beginning. And it is typical that folks within who are very pro-union and pro-unionized teachers are then anti-charter schools in that way. That charter schools typically don't pay their teachers as much and might not give the teachers as much support that they would otherwise receive in a typical traditional public charter school public school environment. One of the things that we see in public charter schools is that teachers self-select to work in these schools based on the mission of the charter school. And so typically, if a school, like even in the videos that you saw, a language immersion school or a place-based school or the Montessori school, they will choose to work in this school because of their passion, because of their particular knowledge, or their connection with the mission for this type of education. And I'm going to say something here that I usually don't say in large groups, so we'll just play this out and see how it goes. But when I'm talking one-on-one or small groups with folks about charter schools, I always call it the quirk factor. So I don't necessarily mean teachers are quirky or something, but school choice, right? These are folks who didn't fit in the traditional system for whatever reason, whether it's the parents or the students. They showed up and either they weren't treated well or they just were quirky themselves, or whatever. So there's kind of this other factor that I think goes into this, people who are more likely to choose an alternative than something else. That isn't just parents and students. I think sometimes it's the educators themselves too. They want something different. And so there's all the politics involved in this, and there's the money that's involved in this too, but there's this other factor of it's different than the traditional system. And so they might actually feel that they have more flexibility, more support, more freedom to be innovative in their classroom, less regulations, less requirements as a teacher. Maybe. They probably are paid less too. And so that sometimes cuts to a certain point where they then choose to go back to the traditional system. In Oregon, most public charter school teachers are, I would say unfortunately, because I think teachers are amazing and I want all the teachers to make six figures, at least. But in public charter schools, unfortunately, most teachers are paid less than their neighborhood school teachers. And that's largely because, and we haven't really even talked about this, but in Oregon, most K-8 charter schools are only receiving 80% of the per pupil funding. And that's part of the legislation. It said that the charter school must receive at least 80% of the per pupil funding. K-9-12 students, it's 95% minimum. So there are a very small percentage of charter schools that get more than that, but most of them are operating on very, very slim budgets. And because they don't own facilities or have access all the time, some do, to district facilities, they're paying market rate for, commercial market rate for their facilities. And so that's a huge chunk of the budget right off the top. And then you pay your teachers and there's nothing left over. Charter schools rely heavily on fundraising as well to kind of make up the budget. So this is a major tension, but specifically when we're talking about teachers, there's a lot of that passion-driven, that keeps making them show up all the time. But it is a real struggle. So the other part with teachers is that teacher qualification piece. Overall, a majority of teachers in public charter schools are licensed. That means they've been through a teacher preparation program at a university or college. They have then done student teaching, and they have met the requirements, passed the tests, and by the Teacher Standards and Practices Board, been licensed to teach in Oregon. So a majority of teachers are actually licensed. But there's this flexibility in the law that allows teachers to receive a charter school registry. So they still have to go through TSPC, that's the licensing board commission, and at least get a background check and fingerprinted. They have to take the civil rights test, just like every other educator in Oregon. And that's about it. So the charter school then has it on their due diligence to say, this is what we need in terms of other requirements or qualifications to be a teacher in our school. What this does is, if used well, it can create opportunities for folks who may have had a career and advanced education in engineering or some other field to come and be a teacher in a public charter school and get the professional development and support to actually be a good teacher. That happens with a big variety, again, it's very different and varied across the state on how teacher registry in charter schools is utilized. For example, some of the things that we saw in these videos, in Montessori education, there's a whole master's program that Montessori teachers often go through that doesn't translate to Oregon licensure. So a lot of times in Montessori schools, and there are 5 public Montessori schools in Oregon, those teachers are registered, but they have very rigorous education and training to be a public school teacher in the Montessori field. And other examples could include music or really anything, and it happens in a variety of ways across the state. Particularly, this is leveraged in those small rural communities where it's very hard to recruit and retain teachers in those communities. And so oftentimes they'll bring in folks from the community who have particular expertise, or they're able to recruit more broadly folks who don't also have a teaching license. And then of course, anybody can do anything poorly too, but for the most part, I would say that most of the charter schools are trying to find really good qualified educators who might not have the full teaching license program of education study. We'll do more questions about this. I see some of you out there stewing. So, 1999 was the first year that Oregon had public charter schools. So we're closing in on 2 decades, and we're looking ahead. The first decade, I would say, is just like, you know, a child growing up. Those first 10 years, a lot happens, and there's rapid growth and a lot of excitement and a lot of stumbling and falling and all of those things. But for the most part, just rapid growth. We saw an explosion in public charter schools in Oregon in that first decade. In the second decade, I would also just describe it as this has been our adolescence years. Puberty hit, and it hit hard. We had some other rapid growth that was pretty uncomfortable and kind of ugly at times. And in Oregon, we have some scars, I would say, from that. So we learned the hard way with some pretty bad closures that happened. One, for example, made the news, and it was right when I was coming into the department, and I got my introduction to working with the Department of Justice and federal investigators, and there was racketeering charges, and I had a panic attack, and I thought, what am I doing? I'm working for the Department of Education. This doesn't seem like what I thought I was going to do. And, you know, they settled, and that happened, and about 8 schools closed. So there's some bad things that have happened. Other things have happened in the same way that other traditional public schools have seen ups and downs. But for the most part, when we look ahead to the next decade, what I am hopeful for is that as the schools are starting to mature, we're going to see some of that quality improvement happen. They're not just going to be scrambling all the time to survive, that we'll actually see them continuously improve and refine their program and get better and get more mature and develop that institutional knowledge, and hopefully we'll see more quality. I also hope that our quality will go up because the number of bad charter schools will go down. And that might mean that we might see like a recession, if you would, in charter schools, some closures happening. I think it's time for districts to say, this charter school is not meeting the mark. Game over. We haven't seen a lot of that in Oregon. Charter schools have traditionally been non-renewed because of financial reasons, not because of academic reasons. So I think we're getting to that point now where I think districts are maybe having the courage within their communities to do that kind of next step if appropriate. And then finally, there's always going to be the economic component to this. Funding for education in Oregon is very, very low overall. And all schools and districts, I would say, are struggling. And then charter schools getting, you know, a little piece of that and trying to do all the things pretty much by themselves are really struggling. And then with PERS, although, you know, I would say just by looking in this room, those of you who have PERS, you're probably doing like tier 1, kind of okay. But, you know, the folks who are paying the PERS bills in the charter schools right now, they're seeing their percentages go up and up and up and up and up at such a rate right now that what was projected to be sustainable 3 or 4 years ago is not even close to sustainable when they're looking at their budgets now. And they're saying, oh my gosh, the only way we can manage to survive as a school is to grow, right? So there's going to be some major tension that goes on in these schools where they're trying to be a small school environment of 120 to 100 to 200 kids. I used to say that 200 kids was right around the sweet spot for when a charter school would be pretty solid. And it's like, you got to have at least 200 kids to be financially sustainable as a charter school. So that'll be interesting. Plus, in the Portland metro area and other areas where we're seeing just astronomical increases in real estate prices, there's a public charter school in Portland that pays $17,500 a month for their facilities. I am sure all of us would rather see those dollars put, you know, toward instructional staff or something for support for students, and the school would too, but there's nowhere else for this school to go unless they build, and nobody can afford property in Portland right now. So anybody have some property they want to donate? You know, that's like what the school's doing. So there are going to be some major struggles, and I think we'll probably see more charter schools close because of financial reasons too. But overall, I'm hopeful that there will be more quality and some discussion around that everywhere. I promised fireworks, so here they are. But that really summarizes the discussion today from my, the stuff that I put in the slides. You all have touched on many things in your questions already, and I'm excited to answer more. There's so much, right? One of the reasons why I love my job at the department is I'm not a specialist who is specialized. I'm a specialist who is generalized in everything. And when I run around the Department of Education, I get to talk to everyone from nutrition to transportation and assessment and standards and equity, and you know, legal is really where I'm housed because so much of this is based in legal stuff. But it's super fun and dynamic, and it's all the things. So we could talk all day, but I gave you kind of like the hour-and-a-half overview. Let's do some questions.
Hi, this is Anne. I agree we could talk all day. I probably have enough questions to talk all day. But the question I'm going to bring up is, do charter schools generally have a requirement for parent involvement in various ways? And is that included in an application process, a commitment to that?
Right. So public charter schools are bound to a lot of the same laws and regulations that traditional schools are, in that you can't require like tuition, right? They're free schools, and you can't require hours of people's time. However, most charter schools do say, but please, 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 please promise us that you'll give us, 20, 40 hours this school year. But the consequence for not showing up should be very minimal. I have heard some stories, and someone called to complain once about a charter school that was then on some level kind of like punishing the student because the parent didn't do as much. And I wouldn't say that that was exactly what probably played out. We did a minor investigation on that. But what a charter school could do is say, we'd really like to get 30 hours of your time. Here's 20 different ways that you can do that at home or, at the school in all these different ways.
Sharon, with the technology emphasis you mentioned, I'm not surprised that public schools would have a little higher math because they can afford the robotics and those kinds of things. With that in the offing, can private industry cooperate with a charter school in doing a big high-tech thing, which would encourage charter schools? If not, then I see the public school kind of a swing back to the public school because of the enormous expense in the tech and the upkeep.
Right. So public education typically and often seeks partnership with private organizations. We see a lot of partnership with Intel and Nike in Oregon, and public charter schools would, on some level, even have more opportunity to partner because they're a nonprofit in a 501c3 way. They can apply for different grants than a school district could, but be able to apply for a lot of the same grants that a school district could. So partnership is definitely available. One of the challenges that charter schools have then is because they're so small, they don't necessarily have the capacity for a full partnership sometimes that like a district would potentially because of their different staff that would be able to manage that partnership. But it is a possibility for public charter schools to partner with private industry.
This is Sylvie. Could I ask how charter schools fare in the arts, in engaging their students in the arts.
I would, so I don't have hard data on this, but I have anecdotal data just from traveling around the state for the last 7 years and being in charter schools that I see a lot of art happening in charter schools. A lot of performing art, a lot of visual and, studio arts happening. Music is one area where I think charter schools do struggle a little bit because it's hard to find music teachers, but I think that's where they're also able to leverage their teacher qualifications and volunteer and partnerships to get a lot of community-based music in their schools. But I think that charter schools, one of the reasons why I hear that parents are choosing public charter schools is because kids get that very integrated education that is not just, this is math time, this is reading time, and that's really what we're going to focus on. But there's lots of art involved. But again, every school is different. There are very classical education, public charter schools where the kids, it's very rigid. They do Latin every day, and it is just like this, So it's all over the board.
This is Sally. Do the charter schools charge a tuition, or can they charge a tuition?
Public charter schools cannot charge tuition. So it is free. It's based on state school funding. Public charter schools, like their neighborhood schools, can charge fees, but they should be doing free and reduced for families that cannot afford.
Hi, this is Dave. My son was one of the earlier students at Howard Street, and he loved it. And to answer Sobe's question, it was geared towards arts and science, I think, and had no sports. I don't know what they're doing these days, but my question is, do all charter schools have their own board, and do they pick the principals?
So in Oregon, a charter school has to have a board. And unless you're one of those single school districts, the charter school board has to be an Oregon nonprofit and a 501c3. There are some public charter schools where there's one board that oversees multiple schools. So we have a handful of those. There's, I think, maybe 5 boards in Oregon that oversee 2 charter schools. There's one board in Oregon that oversees 6 charter schools. So they've replicated. They're the same model. It's one board, and they govern 6 schools in 6 different districts. Typically what happens is that charter governing board does become the employer of the principal, all the staff, and the instructional staff. Sometimes they're just the employer of the principal, and they contract with the district for instructional staff. But typically that board is the employer for the principal, and they do the full recruitment and selection process.
This is Terry. Are there any numbers comparing the dollar cost per student in the public schools compared to the charter schools?
So in Oregon, we base our school funding, state school funding is a whole other lecture that we could do. It would be super fun if you're into like geeky numbers and like formulas written into law. But state school fund, we fund schools based on student average daily membership in the school. So some states do it by a snapshot day. If like this many kids were enrolled on this day, you get X amount of dollars. And we kind of do this ongoing rolling calculation of how many students were there over time, and then you get the amount per student at the end of the year. And then we weight it. So students with special needs who have an IEP get 2 of these student fundings. If you're an English language learner, then you get 1.5, because there's extra support that's required for those students, and so on and so forth. There's lots of different things. There's also the poverty factor. So based on how many kids that are in your district, enrolled in your school, that are living in poverty, you get a little bit more money too. So all of that equates to every single district getting a state school fund allocation per student. And across the state, I don't have the exact average, but it's about $7,300 per student. Some districts it's a little higher, some districts it's a little bit less. We use another calculation that's similar to that to determine the charter school rate. And the charter school rate is typically, depending on how it works out, just a little bit higher than what the district's per student rate is, but it might just be like by $50 or $100. But remember, the charter school's usually only getting 80% of that for their students. So there have been, that I know of, 2 studies that were done that tried to calculate what is the per student funding in a charter school versus the per student funding in a traditional public school. Both of those studies have been heavily refuted by many people on all sides, so I can't say that there's really one out there that would give you a good answer. People within the charter school movement in Oregon say that it's really underfunding these students and that there's a pay equity gap. Folks on the other side say, well, but we're doing in a district 100 things more than what you're doing at your local charter school. And I would say we're probably somewhere in the middle of that. But because a district, when they get their per pupil funding, they distribute it across the district as they see fit. They don't always split it up by, this school gets this much, this school gets this much based on the actual kids who are there. They split it up differently. So there isn't a good answer for that, and the studies that are out there, you can Google them. Charter school student funding equity reports. Take it or leave it. I don't have an opinion on them. I'm neutral.
This is Jim. I just wondered if there's been a study or if you have any information on how happy the parents are with their selection and how happy the students are that they attended charter school.
Yeah, as part of our federal grant in years past, we did some surveying, and satisfaction rates were relatively high, but I don't have that information compared to traditional public schools. Currently, I work closely with the 4 State Board of Education sponsored schools because I do a lot of the work on behalf of the state board, and overall those parents are very satisfied and the students are very satisfied. But again, you have to remember, schools of choice are people voting with their feet. They're opting in and they're opting out. It's very two-way. So it's not often that people who are dissatisfied with a charter school stay. They go. They choose something else. And so I think you would see higher rates of satisfaction in a public charter school than a neighborhood school.
Kate over here, Jinx. Years ago, when the state of Oregon consolidated districts and made everybody do K-12. There was a lot of opposition, particularly out in the rural areas where they felt like they were losing, well, they were, local control of their schools. Am I imagining that in some way the charter schools are allowing that more local control to come back to the communities?
We have seen a number of schools convert where it was a local board, whether it was in that process or in further consolidations following the major push that happened, following that kind of that ongoing consolidation that's happened and closure of small rural schools. We've seen a number of them convert to public charter schools. So that is definitely one way that communities have been able to retain a local public school for their students. And I think that we probably have maybe about 5 of them in Oregon right now that are very much that. And then some that are other versions of something like that.
My name is Henrietta. You know, you mentioned school buses for the charter schools. I was surprised to hear that because where I come from, I thought in charter schools the parents had to bring their children to school, transport them.
So that varies from school to school. Oregon law requires that the public charter school is responsible for transportation. What often happens is the way they say they are meeting that legal requirement is by organizing carpools and by encouraging parents to transport their students. So when we look at the demographic data again and we go back to that, it might make more sense when we think of the less students in poverty and more students with like the access issue to the school, because most charter schools don't have school to home, home to school transportation by bus. However, there are some that have prioritized that and do access transportation, but it's not all of them, and that is a major barrier to these schools.
Hi, this is Jim. I'm in favor of charter schools. I think it's a great idea. On the other hand, if I were responsible for the Oregon budget in some way or other, I think I would be looking at it as a system, more or less, and looking for means to resolve the budget issues that are very apparent on both sides, public and charter schools. And I guess one of the things I would look at is perhaps charging that difference that you mentioned between the charter school per student cost and the public school to the parents, and having scholarships and all the rest, making it affordable for everybody to some degree. It's already going to be a minimal charge compared to private schools, I think. But I would be looking at it from that point of view. It just seems to me we're draining the overall educational system of the state with this double system.
I work for the Oregon Department of Education, so I'm going to say I'm neutral on that. Nice comment. What I will say is, so I'm going to ask you all a few questions. So how many of you have relatives like grandchildren or nieces, nephews, whatever, who are attending or who have attended public schools? Okay. How many of you have supported fundraisers and or contributed toward public education in some form of donation? We're all subsidizing the public education system, one way or the other. Everybody needs more money to do public education in Oregon. So I have major concerns as someone who's a proponent of public education and charging tuition for anyone. And yet, at the same time, those who have the means, or even those with some means, we're all helping keep it alive. So it's a struggle.
There seems to me a lot of things that confront the public charter school that may get in the way of the educational process. You mentioned several of them. One I think of is facilities, maintenance, all of those issues, which in a consolidated large district like Salem-Keizer is handled quite well, even though not perfectly. I don't see that that will improve, and I don't know how charter schools can grow and have those types of facilities and make sure they meet all the standards that we're supposed to have in schools.
Mm-hmm. Right, so facilities, are most of you in Salem? Who is not part of Salem-Keizer School District area? Okay, so a small group. I don't know how much Salem-Keizer has been doing in the realm of seismic upgrades and all of that work, but that's a major thing that's happening around the state right now. Unfortunately, there are too many schools that if we were to have the Cascadia earthquake or even a moderate earthquake would put students at risk. So there's been a lot of work around seismic upgrades, and that costs a lot of money. And so there are the opportunities for communities to go up for bond and do that. One of the challenges, yes, for charter schools is they don't have access to bonds. Now, a district could include a charter school in its bond, but the district would own the building. They would not, it wouldn't be a charter school owned building. It would be a district facility. So a district could do that. I don't know that that's ever happened in Oregon, at least very explicitly. And so they can't go out for bonds, but they're typically renting. So you have two things. They're either renting facilities that are then managed and upkept, you know, by their landlord, you would hope at least. But oftentimes we also see charter schools renting old church buildings and whatnot, and they're still not the owner. There's a landlord who's somewhat responsible here, but the charter schools do have to do a lot of maintenance, upgrades, making sure it's ADA compliant, all of those pieces to ensure that the students and the families have access to the building. And it is a major cost, and it does sometimes consume much of the budget that does then become a barrier, and you see schools struggling to see their future sustainability and viability.
You're too young to remember this, but at one time there was a proposal that they shift the school times by thirds so that the schools buildings would always have students in them, and you would have to have less buildings because you're using them year round. Have you heard about that, and is anybody even seriously considering doing that?
Right. So I have not heard statewide, you know, in terms of like the traditional, like the overall K-12 system, that they're looking at doing year-round school calendars or rotating students through buildings. However, public charter schools have flexibility to do that kind of thing. And there are some charter schools that do very extended day programs where students can have access to the school from 7 a.m., 6:30 a.m. until 7 p.m. And the school day itself runs from like 8 to, I think they're doing like 7:30 until 3:30. It's like a longer day at the school too. And then there are some schools that do, they start all the way at the beginning of August, and they get students out in May. And I've been talking to a charter school recently that's interested in doing year-round school and moving to that calendar. There are some challenges because the rest of the system kind of closes down, but the school could, in effect, potentially do that. I haven't heard specifically about Oregon going to that, but I think local districts could potentially have that discussion, and charter schools definitely have the flexibility to do that.
Hi, this is Joan. In the video, one of the videos with the charter school students speaking, one of the boys said that one of the things he liked about his school was that he was able to form a Bible club. In public schools, there would certainly be restrictions on Bible clubs. So what kind or how much religion can charter schools incorporate or teach, or how much support can they or do they receive from churches or religious organizations?
Right, good question. I know when I see that video, I kind of go, ooh, every time, and then I'm like, no, okay, I can have it. Because in traditional public schools, you can have students form clubs based on religious affiliation, and those clubs can have access to facilities in the same manner that any other club has access to facilities, but it can't be part of the core curriculum, it can't be part of regular instruction, it can't be during class time. There's all these different rules and regulations depending on how that plays out in each school and district. Public charter schools must be non-sectarian. So they cannot be religiously affiliated, they cannot offer religious instruction or proselytize or do any of that within the school, just as you would expect your traditional public school to do. So they're the same standards and same levels.
Hello, my name's Dominic. I was wondering if there's been any research done in regards to the use of public facilities, such as let's say, part of a building being isolated and led and used as a charter school instead of, that would reduce the rent. I mean, $17,000 a month is, if you're a big business, that's nothing, but obviously for a public education system, it is. I'm just wondering if there are ways that we could just use our resources better to alleviate some of those costs.
There are a handful of charter schools across the state who co-locate with their neighborhood school or with another neighborhood school. And so they will sometimes be in the same building, and sometimes there's some shared facilities, and sometimes it's very separate. There are a number of charter schools around the state who are, as their neighbors would say, lucky enough that they got a district building and the district only charges them $1 a year or something. So again, like the amount to which schools are paying could be anything from like very little, almost nothing, to crazy amounts of rent. But co-locating is definitely something that charter schools usually start there. Can we have a district facility? Can we share a facility? And then they start going elsewhere.
This is Joyce. And a few years ago, I had a friend who was homeschooling her children, and I know that she was able to send her boys to the public school to participate in the sports programs there. And I just wondered if the charter schools can do the same thing. I'm not sure that they were able to do that with the music programs, but I think sports was one avenue.
Mm-hmm. Monday at 1 p.m. you can come to Senate Ed, or you can log in online and hear a very exciting debate on this topic that is going through the legislature right now. I'll be there. You can come sit next to me. It'll be fun. So there's always been rules that there have been no rules prohibiting a district from allowing a public charter school student to participate. So they've always could if the district wanted them or allowed it. There's new legislation that now requires that a district provide access to activities, athletics, music, art, all those things. And that gets really complicated really quick. It's like, oh, that kind of seems like a good idea, right? Like, we let private school kids do that. We let homeschool kids do that. Why not let our public charter school kids have the same access? But the reality of implementing that is very challenging. And so we're debating that right now.
Is there a waiting list to get in most of these charter schools?
Right. So admittance to a public charter school is first by application. So everybody who wants to go to a charter school must apply. You don't just get sent there. No one can make you go to a public charter school. It's a school of choice. So after you've applied, the charter school says, well, we have, 20 seats available. If they have 20 applications, everybody's in. If they have 40 applications and only 20 seats available, they have to do a blind lottery. And so they do lottery to see who gets in, who gets those 20 seats. Everybody who went through the lottery but didn't get a seat gets added to the wait list. And so some charter schools have 200 kids on their wait list. Some charter schools don't have a wait list, and you can read into that what you want. But some charter schools do have very significant, very competitive wait lists, and most of those charter schools are usually only admitting kids in kindergarten, so it's however many seats are in kindergarten. And there's no special tricks. You don't get to pay people, extra donations to get to the top of the list. And if you hear about that, let me know, because we need to shut it down. But you can't go to a private preschool and then, because you went to this school, get special privileges to get in. But the only way that you get kind of special ways to get in is if you already have a sibling in the school. The charter school can get siblings to the top of that list. Charter schools, typically, a lot of them have asked for waivers of this law so that they can give priority enrollment to children of teachers. That helps charter schools kind of retain teachers if their kids are also going to the school, which also then gets into some equity and access issues that the state board has debated a lot over the years. But that's another way. But typically it's everybody has access, but if there's limited seats, you got to do an equitable lottery.
Well, this has been a vigorous time for us. Thank you so much for coming.
Absolutely. Thank you.